And 1 year you can go to the race. 1 year. Yes. Else. Andy here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our various students, faculty, and other participants.
It's my pleasure today to welcome Professor Danny Sokol and talk about in a moment. We are going to have, the structure is going to be that we're going to start with a key presentation by Professor Sokol, and then we're going to have a series of short comments by various faculty members that I'll also present shortly, and then we'll open it to Q&A. Maybe we'll let Danny have a few words in between, but I'm not sure. We'll see how hard we want to hit. Okay, so Professor Sokol is going to speak about cookie intermediaries as competition leads to more privacy. And for those who have not had a chance to look, Professor Sokol is the Carolyn Craig Franklin Chair in Law and Professor of Law and Business at the USC Gould School of Law. He's also an affiliate professor of business at the Marshall School of Business, where he teaches in the marketing department. And this tidbit is actually significant because the nature of Professor Sokol's work is really at the intersection of law, business, and a number of other related disciplines. He's a faculty director of the Center for Transnational Law and Business and co-director of the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition, also relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Additionally, he serves part-time as a senior advisor at White & Case. He is among the top 10 most cited antitrust law professors in the past 5 years, focuses on the issues that businesses face, particularly with respect to competition. So not just antitrust generally, but things like data breaches that we'll hear about today, corporate governance, compliance, innovation, M&A, and so on and so forth. Professor Sokol is a member of the ALI, American Law Institute. He also serves as an academic advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a non-governmental advisor to the International Competition Network. Professor Sokol is highly prolific academic. I counted more, I think 11 edited volumes in the last iteration, probably there's more by now, and ballparking at about 70 peer-reviewed and law-reviewed articles in his years as a scholar, and we look forward to hearing from him. After Professor Sokol, we're going to have, beginning with Professor Ahmed Abbasi from the Mendoza School of Business. Professor Abbasi is the Joe and Jane Giovanni Professor of IT Analytics and Operations at Mendoza. He came to us in 2020 from UVA, where he was Associate Dean and Chair at the McIntire School of Commerce. At Mendoza, he's also the Director of the Analytics PhD program and co-director of the Human-Centered Analytics Lab. Professor Abbasi's research interests relate to text and predictive analytics, again, very relevant, and that's why he's here today as an expert in that area. Ahmed has published nearly 100 articles in journals and conference proceedings. He's a leading scholar in his field. Just to illustrate, his work has been funded by over a dozen grants, not only from the National Science Foundation, but also from industry partners like Microsoft, eBay, Deloitte, and Oracle. Professor Abbasi serves as a senior editor or editor of leading journals in his field, and he's a recipient of numerous awards that I'm not going to spend so much time lining all of them up. So it's really terrific to have Professor Abbasi with us to give sort of the analytics perspective. After that, we hear comments from our own Professor Tricia Belia, who's, for those who don't know, if there is anybody in the audience, she's the William J. and Dorothy O'Neill Professor of Law and Presidential Fellow here at Notre Dame. Professor Belia is an expert in constitutional law, admin law, cyber law, in particular electronic surveillance law and copyright law. She's the co-author of a leading cyber law casebook and published several articles on internet law. And of particular relevance, of course, is her work on surveillance and privacy issues for today. Professor Belia earned her A.B. summa cum laude from Harvard, where she was elected Phi Beta Kappa. Before attending Yale Law School, she also worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, serving as an editor for Foreign Policy magazine and co-authoring a book on self-determination movements. At Yale, she served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, executive editor of the Yale Journal of International Law, and student director of the Immigration Legal Services Clinic. Without detailing all of Professor Belia's many achievements since then, Let me just note that after graduation, she clerked for Judge Cabranes at the Second Circuit, Justice O'Connor at the Supreme Court, and following her clerkship for 3 years as attorney advisor in the DOJ Office of Legal Counsel. Since 2009, very important here at Notre Dame, and I would say nationally, Professor Belia served as a chair of the university's faculty board on athletics, the principal advisory group to the president on educational issues relating to intercollegiate athletics. And in addition to that, she also serves as Notre Dame's faculty athletics representative to the NCAA. Last but not least, Professor Maria Macia, who's an associate professor of law and one of our own law and market behavior faculty fellows. Professor Macia is an economist by training, whose research considers the regulation of corporations and valuation issues through an empirical approach. Professor Macia considers the effects of regulations that encourage corporate social responsibility and risk management, and she has particular interest in disclosure requirements and the regulation of banks. Professor Macia's expertise, though, is not limited to these areas. She's an expert in law and economics, empirical methods, antitrust, which she also teaches here, on occasion in corporate finance. Professor Macia holds a JD from University of Chicago Law School, where she was an articles editor for the Law Review, and a PhD in economics, also from the University of Chicago. And finally, before joining us here at Notre Dame, just 4 years ago, which we were very happy about, Professor Macia served as a law clerk to Judge Andrew Hurwitz on the Ninth Circuit. Professor Macia also worked, for those who do not know, as an economic consultant on antitrust matters. So she actually dealt with the empirical aspects on antitrust on the ground, not just from an academic perspective. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Sokol to open our panel. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for the very warm welcome here. I'm so glad that we have people, not just in the law school, we have a number of people from Mendoza. I want to thank your Dean, Marcus Cole, who's really one of the most transformational deans in American law schools today, and really, I think so much of what we see, you're building off of, what one could say, off of the shoulders of giants, but you're taking the school to yet another level of excellence, and we notice on the West Coast, among other places. When we're not watching season 16 of Housewives of Orange County and season 12 of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, but who's counting what season we're on? So it's really a great honor. It's a great privilege, particularly at a school that believes very strongly in faith. I think it's a very big deal, and this is competitive advantage in many ways for the school. Because it turns out product differentiation is really important, and it turns out some 90% of all law schools are basically fungible in terms of their approach. So it's really great to be at a place that has a true, unique mission, and that actually takes the mission seriously. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay, is I'm going to just give you some background as to cookies. These are not the kind of cookies that you remember from Sesame Street, which in today's world apparently is no longer an everyday thing for Cookie Monster, but apparently only a sometimes treat. So this tells us we now go with healthy. But actually cookies are sort of mixed even in this world. Essentially, it's a way of creating targeted advertising. So we think that targeted advertising overall is a good thing. We get much better ads. You create all kinds of value across different sides of a platform. Advertisers are better off, consumers are better off, but there are some trade-offs. And the reason why this matters broadly, that I want to make sure everyone is aware of, is because we are seeing regulatory efforts in Europe, in Asia, in the United States to regulate technology-related platforms. And the big takeaway from the paper is these are very nuanced issues. The political discourse is anything but nuanced, and there may be unintended consequences. And we work through what that looks like. And in many ways, what we're going to show you is a regulatory story that looks very much like other regulatory stories in terms of effects. But actually, in some ways, what I'm going to tell you is also a supply chain type story. So think about a digital supply chain, but think about something else that happens. So I'm going to just talk to you about salad, since many of you are eating. So what can I do better than just to scare you? So imagine you've got lettuce, and somewhere in the supply chain, it turns out you've discovered that there's salmonella in your lettuce. It really does happen. You're not quite sure where it came from. Oh my God, you're like, but now I'm not going to eat the salad. No, you should still eat the salad. It's fine. But you know that somehow there's a bad impact. You're not quite sure where in the supply chain it comes from, so they do this massive recall. In a sense, I want to make you frame what I'm doing within that kind of analogy as well, which is that we know there's a problem, and to quote Taylor Swift, we have a problem, now we're going to solve it. Or at least that's what I'm going to get to. So this is joint work with Arian Chung and David/Taiwei Wang, and it's really the first look at this particular type of issue of looking at the dark web. We'll talk about the dark web in a second. It's not the web that most of you are on. I'm hoping you're not on the dark web, but some of your information may be, and we'll talk about how that can be scary too. And then sort of what are the broader implications? So overall, how do I position where we are? Turns out many of you are giving away your data to first-party providers all the time. One thing I could do is literally take you to any number of the apps that you use on a regular basis. Let's just take two of them. Spotify or Netflix. If you think that the only way that Spotify or Netflix make money is off of your subscription, that is not correct. They are selling your data. And if you look, you're like, when did I agree with that? When you click by downloading the app, okay? Unfortunately, how much, we don't know. Why? Because we don't break down for publicly traded companies how much money you're making specifically for buying and selling of data. But data is important, and it's going to be only more important. And we have a number of IS professors who can explain why in more detail. But the short answer is we've shed data the way we basically breathe. And if you don't think, even with all your privacy settings, that you're giving off data, congratulations. How about the locational tracking from your cell phone? You're giving off data, even if you're opting out of everything that you could imagine. So the question is, how do these data intermediaries work? So these are basically the ones who are using, and here we're looking specifically at the ones who are using cookies, and they buy and they sell. Who are they? Increasingly we know, and here's the big shock that we can test. So it turns out California passed rules that you actually have to register if you're a data broker. Now it turns out you don't always have to register, but who's going to register? This looks a lot like a finance or accounting type situation. The larger companies with better compliance are the ones more likely to register. And so we have a sense of how that works, and that's much better than what we've known in the past, and it's fairly new. Not every state has passed it. We'll go sort of through that when we get to outcomes. And it turns out we have privacy breaches all the time. So what's a data breach versus a privacy breach? Actually, there's a legal distinction that we're going to hear about later probably. But for our purposes, I'm going to just lump them all together of information that is commercially sensitive ends up with bad people. And we'll just leave it at that for now. And we've seen quite a number of these cases. We're just going to see more of these cases going forward. So what are data brokers? This, again, for a long time in the literature was unclear. What's a data broker? You know what our definition is? Vermont law and California law actually tell us what a data broker is. So now at least we have a definition that works, because at least some companies are taking note of that. What do I want you to sort of take away? Number one, what do we buy and sell data about? Everything! Everything! Oh my God! And you see, much the same way as with everything else, we have differentiation. Some data is more valuable than others. And we could play through why it is that parents, our expected parents are somehow less valuable than people with addiction. But that may be in Q&A. So, by the way, you can tell I also teach in a business school because the slides are so much colorful than when you just teach only in law. More pictures too. So again, there's a lot of money in the data broker industry. We sort of guesstimate how much it is, and here you just get a sense of exactly how pervasive it is, how much is used per month, what percentage is used for consumers, and in fact, the reality is this is a huge industry. It's a huge industry that we really don't have enough study of in the academic literature. And this is true across fields, even in IS, surprisingly. And largely it's because of opaque data. So ironically, right, we don't have enough data on data brokers. So I just want to give you a sense of, again, how significant it is of what kind of data we collect on people. And in many ways, it's a very positive story. We have a lot of data. We can make increasingly more targeted advertising. It's really useful. So for example, here in South Bend, if I do some kind of search on the internet, I'm going to get a targeted ad, whether it's Facebook, actually none of you are using, or Instagram, or Google, or whatever it is that you're using. The ads are going to be targeted to, like, oh, football when it's in season, right? Or simply like restaurants here, or maybe weekend in Chicago, depending whatever it is that you're doing. And that's great because real estate in Arizona is not really helpful to you. So this is just to give you an expansive view, and I have a number of slides. I just want to, but they're available for all of you. So I just want to go through this quickly. That this is just sort of an alarming thing of how much data is being bought and sold. Some of you say, I'm happy with the trade-off. Like, really, I am. By the way, so am I. But then we get the data breaches. We'll talk about that in a second. But this is just to show you how much data is collected. And this creates all kinds of opportunities for companies to really create value. And so this is just to point that out. But I also want to suggest that, and we can update this, but I didn't have a good graph. Large companies right now are under attack around the world. This is just in Europe, but you see cases in the United States as well, including yesterday's antitrust decision with regards to Facebook. Earlier in the week, there was an antitrust decision with regard to Apple. We have lots of cases on across areas of law focusing on big tech platforms, but this is now very much in the eyes of Congress as well. Potential legislation on the antitrust side for ex-ante regulation, but frankly also privacy regulation, and not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. It's also global. And the big question is that we get is like, aha, we're concerned from an antitrust perspective because large platforms, also have data, and somehow, more data is going to hurt on with regard to competition. And that's the kind of the first quote from sort of the leading skeptic in Australia. And sort of below is a more measured response by an empiricist who really deals a lot in this interface, and basically made her career as being among the first to really hit this privacy versus competition kind of area. But there have been many papers since that suggest there may be some kind of tension. So we're going to really play in that space just to give you a sense of where we're going. So it turns out we now understand we've always believed that competition is not just on price or a traditional measure of output, but actually also on non-price. The current chair of the Federal Trade Commission thinks differently, thinks up until now we've never cared about non-price. The movement is called neo-Brandesian. But as Joe Bauer, Joe, you started teaching here in 1974? 1973. As, even by your standards, in the age of the dinosaurs, when Brandeis was actually on the bench, we remember Chicago Board of Trade, which was not at all about price, but somehow this is forgotten by sort of the movement that is now ascendant in the United States, that somehow price never mattered. And for those of you who don't know Joe is now retired, but Joe was one of the leaders, particularly with regards to vertical contracting and something called Robinson Patent that once again is making its comeback. So, Joe, you only had to wait until retirement to all of a sudden, like, yes. So what I wanted to sort of point out here is that the traditional narrative in antitrust was, oh, competition and privacy, they're like peanut butter and jelly. Literally, this was this is what Tim Mura said when he was chairman of the FTC. Tim, also professor at George Mason, he said that at this point 15 years ago when he was chair, and they were complementary. And this was a view that people understood for a long time. Increasingly, we have empirical work that says not so fast. In certain settings, these two issues may be in tension. And so we try to build across that. And here, just to show you on the right-hand side, just to show you a sense of how this evolves with one company that we're all familiar with, in terms of how privacy may evolve over time. This is one that has had literally the largest fine in the history of the Federal Trade Commission with regards to a data breach. You're familiar with it because just 3 months ago, they thought that the metaverse was going to be the way forward that's going to transform the world. And as of the other week, all of a sudden they realized, no, it's AI. So you see how quickly companies pivot. So I actually want to focus on data brokers. We know very little about data brokers. It's taken us a while to figure out what is a data broker. The great thing that we have is actually a data broker. California law tells us what it is. But there are really interesting questions here. What you have on the right-hand side was how the FTC tracked data brokers in a report literally a decade ago. Since they only looked at 12 companies, they didn't even actually know how many data brokers there were. They didn't know what they really did. And it turns out we know a lot more now, but this just gives you a sense of how they got information about data brokers. We build on that in some new and distinct ways. So again, you saw this earlier in terms of our slide and sort of how we're thinking about topics, but it's now, having given you some background, now we're going to get to the results. We want to understand competition at two levels. Number one, about these first-party firms. Number two, the data brokers themselves. So we have certain hypotheses, and notice that they're in parallel. And the basic question is whether or not the more concentrated a firm is, i.e. the more likely you're to have market power, potentially be dominant, potentially have an antitrust issue. What does this tell us about the likelihood that we're going to see a data breach? And we play through this at both levels, both at the company level and at the data broker level. So it turns out, who is a data broker? It's not necessarily the companies you would think of, but in many ways, it's really interesting because it also gives you a sense of who's lobbying in what industry, and oh, what a surprise. The big four are data brokers. They also have large digital transformation practices, Oracle business software, and oh, those last three, they're the ones that do your credit scoring. So here's the problem. In the United States, we have no national privacy legislation. I mean, we have the FTC that's been doing data-related stuff since the 80s and is quite aggressive sometimes, but this is a big gap. So we're looking at state level, and California matters because basically size, sometimes looks. But there have been efforts to increase data broker transparency. I'm just going to quickly go through here. How do we see it? Like literally, these are the screenshots. You can actually find out data about data brokers. It's almost Seinfeldian. I'm going to have a coffee table book about coffee tables. And so we can do that with regards to both California and Vermont, and we're able to, I'm just going to get quickly through because I'm running out of time. So we have cookies. I'm not going to be able to go through detail, but many of you understand how cookies work, and if you don't, read the paper because I'm running out of time. But there are actually two different models here for how we actually get money from the cookies, and the best way to explain it to you is literally just pull it from the people who are monetizing it. I actually want to get somehow to what we look at. This is what your personal information actually looks like from where, for cookies from the Internet Archive, because we want to track that. So what is it that we're doing? We have data that we get from a number of different sources because we want to understand data breaches and what actually appears on the dark web. So what is the dark, and this is literally, this would be like what you can find on the dark web about yourself. So there's the regular web, and then there's bad people. That's the dark web. You're trading guns, drugs, personal information, and like you don't want these people having your information, and yet it's there. And the question is, well, what might that tell us about how industry is organized? So we have two different measures of concentration. The first is a textual analysis based by my colleague Jerry Hoberg that has transformed how we think about accounting and finance, a much better way of trying to understand industry level concentration. And we find highly concentrated firms are the ones less likely to have data breaches. Then at the data broker level, both, I kid you not, Cloudflare, which is a data security company, and Wayfair, which you probably all buy furniture from, are both registered data brokers. How do we figure out, how they're competing? I have literally made up this measurement. I want to make sure where does it come from? My imagination. But it's frankly better than, say, Bronwyn Hall's like, oh, I'm going to measure innovation by the number of patents. No, really, like patent counting. And that's been an important thing in econ, so I have something a little bit better. We look for co-mentions on GitHub. And the idea being, if you're more likely to mention two firms and you're a nerdy computer programmer, probably you're competing on some level. And if you have a better measurement, I'd love to hear it. And yes, we're not looking at individual firms at level, and we don't know who's exactly competing on what for data brokers. Why? Because we don't have transparency in what's publicly available. So this is the best we do. But in that world where that's the best we do, what is it that we find? Very, very strong results. Wow, this is what's really cool. Once we get down to our final sample, you see how we get there, we get some really, really strong results that show at both levels. The idea that the larger the firm, in terms of market share, as an inference for market power, the less we have to worry about data breaches. And so this is a compliance story that we see. For example, the financer, this is Sarbanes-Oxley related story too. We see it across lots of areas. You need to have enough to invest. But there's something else going on that's interesting. If you're a first-party provider of data, you don't need to trade as much with data brokers. Why? You have your own data. So it's just fewer touch points. So these are our actual results, and we'll let the reviewers have more time with that because I'm literally running out of time, and I have 1 minute left, and we see the same results over time here with regard to firm-level competition. And I'm just going to go to the summary at this point. So what is it that we find? Basically what I've told you, the higher level of concentration, the fewer data breaches that we have. What are some of the limitations that I want to note? Number one, it's not like there's a single dark web. There are actually multiple dark webs out there. It's not like they advertise, hi, we're the dark web. So we were able to track one dark web provider in terms of the breaches. We hope that they are similar to other dark web providers. We're able to only track those those breaches where we have cookies. We only look at publicly traded firms. Can we draw broader inferences? I think enough to note that this is a very nuanced area, and we have to be thinking about all these areas for competition and privacy from a policy perspective going forward, where we've been looking at it in a non-holistic way. And I'll stop there because I'm actually forced to stop there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Sokol, we'll start with Professor Bassi. I think he's going to talk about.
Oh, okay. I can continue to start. So, Danny, thank you for that really exciting and engaging study. And I have to start with the business school pitch. So, Danny is about the median in terms of charisma and teaching caliber for the business school. Is that fair to say? So we're kind of right in the middle, right? Is that? I'm kidding.
Slide here, but to be at the top at USC Marshall, you have to bring like
Donuts.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much,
no,
yeah.
yeah.
That's always the function of high level reviews, like this person was great. They brought donuts from the following place, and it's actually in the review, like, oh my God, you actually like list where the donuts are from. That's a form of competition as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was going to get at with that was another thing you left out is that you have to make Sesame Street references when you're lecturing in business school. And for me, sort of as an AI person, it's nice to, a lot of the panels I've been on the last 10 years, the state of the art for AI has involved models called Elmo and Bird. So it's nice to be able to talk about Cookie Monsters. Thank you for that, starting there. So this is very impactful, very timely work. And I'm going to kind of give the analytics perspective a little bit. Two of the theories that are motivating this, sort of, if you think about this privacy, competition tension, in any business school, in a strategy class, in an MBA program, we start with 4 or 5 forces, which is sort of driving the competition side of this. And we also talk about the resource-based view of the firm, which is sort of that firms have resources and capabilities, what we own and what we do with it, right? And so those two perspectives are very complementary because one is more internal looking and the other is external facing. And I think in this study, what's happening is the privacy side of the tension is being informed in terms of the hypotheses by the resource-based view that, hey, data is a primary asset, therefore we must protect it. We must make sure we have some privacy on there, bad for business if there's breaches. And the competition side is obviously very, very straightforward. I think there's an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into this theoretical perspective, because if you think about the last 15, 20 years, one of the most exciting ideas has been this notion of competing on analytics, right? And so that's, and Danny used the word monetization there. But what we know from competing on analytics is that this data monetization strategy idea has emerged. And it turns out there's 3 major ways in which firms monetize data. One of them is selling data, right? And that's sort of the focus here. But there's 2 other ways. One is to use data internally to improve processes, process augmentation, process automation. So if I'm Netflix, I want to use those cookies that are boomeranging back to me. We'll talk about that in a second. And I want to provide better recommendations so you're staying on the site longer, right? And then the other more emergent way is data wrapping, where I'm improving and augmenting the customer value proposition through the data, right? So if I'm Apple, I'm providing through analytics better products like Siri that works better, right? Or Google Maps that's more effective. And I think the reason that could be interesting here is my data monetization strategy, for competing on analytics, as the saying goes, you never want to outsource a source of competitive advantage, right? So I think there might be an opportunity to further featurize the empirical models by looking at this notion of the analytics capability maturity and the data monetization strategies that these firms are using, right? And some of that came out. If you look at Oracle, look at credit score ratings, look at the Big Four, look at Wayfair, those are generally not regarded as analytics leaders to the same extent that, say, a Netflix or Google would be. And in fact, a study done at MIT, you mentioned information systems. So MIT has this Center for Information Systems Research called CISR, and they did a survey of how firms are monetizing data. So across those 3 categories that we just talked about, for leaders in analytics, it turns out, and this is self-reported, so obviously they're going to downplay how much they're selling data, but they found that their portfolio of data monetization was about 60% improving processes, 30% wrapping around data, and that was the growth area. It's all about improving the value prop through AI and machine learning, and only 10% data brokerage. The other thing to note related to this is when we talk about this data monetization, you can think about the data as part of a value chain, right? So what we're getting with cookies, and I think Danny had this really nice slide about it, is generally speaking, as these cookies are boomeranging, the first party, like the Facebook cookie as it's circulating, are click streams, search, and what we view, what we watch, and so forth. But the real value is when that comes back to the companies. So there is this snowballing, and PII is not just in PII, as we know. So the analytics is also, has privacy implications, because those models are inferring some things about us, right? So I think that's more of an interesting future direction, and Danny's work being connected to where we are. My last thought, very briefly here, is I have to mention ChatGPT in the world we live in. A lot of brokering has been Google and ad and so forth. Everyone knows Google, 95% of their revenue comes from ads. Google is a one-click pony, as we like to call them. But now that search is moving towards prompting, could it be that our dark web has not just information about what we watch and review, but our psychological profiles and those things? So that's why it's even more crucial that we are better equipped to understand how these first parties are managing and protecting our data. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Please,
Thank you. Yeah, so I am gonna come from a privacy perspective, but I'm gonna sort of say at the start of the paper, I'm not sure what concept of privacy you have in mind in the paper. They're dropped, so I'm gonna stay very basic with that. Because, I teach cyber law, I write about electronic surveillance. It's very easy for us to care about information that government gets about us. But we seem to care a lot less about information that private parties get to us, and a lot of what we talk about is terms like consumer information leakage or customer privacy leakage or data leakage. But you're also talking about data breaches. I would submit that there's a bigger picture here that needs to be thought through before we can kind of grasp the impact of your paper, right? So when I think about privacy issues that your paper raising, is it the fact that we're sharing information at all, right? Because as you pointed out, we all click things that say I agree, and embedded in that is some transfer of information that we really don't know, or that the average consumer doesn't know. Is the problem the lack of transparency with how our data is used? Maybe transparent in that we click I agree, but it's really not that transparent to most of us. Is it the risk that it's going to be further shared in a lawful way? We give it over to this first party who gives it to the third party, who then gives it over to someone else, and all of that may be a perfectly lawful transfer of information intended to it, but it still could be really problematic, right? Is it the aggregation of the data and the profile that it paints about you, kind of like you were alluding to? Some of the stuff that you put up there on the screen that data brokers know about us, the really concrete story that we always talk about in cyber law is the daughter, the Target case, right? So you've got this daughter who starts getting mail from Target that is advertising things like diapers and baby clothes and things along those lines. And her father kind of pitches a fit and says, why am I getting all of this stuff from Target? Well, it turns out that some of the purchase that she had made gave a profile of her that indicated that she was pregnant, and she in fact was. The father comes back 6 months later and was like, yeah, you know what? You were right, right? So that kind of a scary profiling that is on the extreme end, that's what that rubber is doing. Is that the problem? Or is it, as I think your paper sometimes suggesting, the breach? Like, I think to the extent that you're talking about a data breach, that is the tip of the iceberg for privacy, or at least from a consumer perspective, that's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's a much larger problem, or we should have much larger concerns, but we don't necessarily bring those to fruition. So I would suggest that in the paper somewhere, we need to see a much broader discussion or better definition of what the privacy harm is that you're trying to address or solve, right? Is it really the breach? Or is it just the transfer of data that we're making? Is it the aggregation? What exactly is it that you're aiming for? Because I think the paper can be more impactful if you can actually identify what the privacy harm is. And just the second area that I would just touch upon is, you alluded to the fact that we don't have a nationwide privacy framework. Again, if we say we want a nationwide privacy framework, I'm not sure what subcategory of privacy it's supposed to address, but to the extent that we have these states that are, regulating data brokers and creating registries, your paper touches upon this, that you're more likely to see sharing with registered data brokers. I would love to hear more about that. How does that matter for our regulatory framework? Should all states be registered? Should we have a federal registry? Because I got the implication from what I read that, these states aren't really concretely providing you with any privacy protections. So registration is actually a free pass, right? So So the fact that all the data is shared with registered, not unregistered, how does that actually pay out in the regulatory regime that we should have? So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and we'll just retrieve our series of comments.
Thank you, Danny, for presenting this. I have been following your blog since I was, I think, in college possibly. So it's really great to actually get to comment on one of your papers. So I think this is an incredibly important contribution. We now are more and more using products as consumers where we are not actually paying a physical $1 price to it. The price we're paying is in terms of our privacy. So if we're thinking about evaluating the antitrust implications of mergers, for example, we need to be able to predict what will the effect of the merger be on consumers' privacy protection. We're thinking about consumer welfare, and this is a huge contribution to that literature. And it also really uses, I mean, there's a lot of elbow grease in the data collection on this, really creative data sets here. And I think you'll get quite a few papers out of that putting them together. So my first point is sort of related to the data, and I think you alluded to the fact that this is a hard area to get data, and so basically we're using proxies for things. And so I have some questions about maybe thinking a little bit more in the paper as you continue to revise it about the limitations of these proxies and trying to do some work to convince the readers that these are really good proxies. So with regulation, I think that was one example. So you talk about an interest in determining the effectiveness of data broker regulation, but then the measure that's used is really, I think, more of a compliance measure of whether they actually register. So it's a great first start, I think, of whether they are facing regulation, but there might be some alternative measures that you could use. So maybe using whether these companies are subject to California or Vermont laws. You could do something like a difference. Another example might be just thinking about FTC fines. So every time the FTC imposes a large fine in this area, that's a signal of their desire to regulate the area. We could look at what happens after those fines rather than before. So just some ways to add some other measures of that might confirm that proxy. The other proxy that I think is super creative, this idea of using GitHub as for sort of the concentration for the data brokers. I think the question is which are the companies or who's putting the code on there and who's being left out. So what if it's the case that a company has a regulation that its software, those developing the software can't put any of the code on GitHub? Because you can imagine that that creates vulnerabilities. People can see the code for the software. Then it might be the case that companies that are more careful are not using GitHub. And they're more likely to use certain data brokers that are more careful. So there could be sort of this underlying problem where the data, the market share on GitHub is actually sort of correlated with what you want to measure. So one way around that, maybe drop all entries where if you're finding that the market share is 0, for example, because those might be the ones that are just the super careful data brokers. The other thing is you might be able to match this up with reporting from 10Ks for revenues, and we could get a sense. So that might give us a sort of a rough measure of the market share for the data brokers, and we could just see how well that lines up with your finding with GitHub. If it lines up very well, then it's a really good proxy. So that would just be helpful to see when evaluating it. And then the final proxy that's used is the Hoberg-Phillips HHI. And this one, I think, this one I think is really important to get right because we're thinking about this in the context of antitrust. And the concern I have with this proxy is that it's measuring the entire company's HHI, when in reality, what might be relevant for antitrust analysis, you would want to see sort of the market share of the piece that is relevant for data for consumers. And so, maybe rerunning the analysis by focusing on the companies where we think that might be a better fit and see if the results persist could be helpful. And you could tell stories why you might be capturing results where if your concentration is going down, it might be that you face competition and actually a pretty unrelated area to your consumer data. And so you have less resources because you're not competing in that area. And so you see these effects that in the data where you have more leakages. But that wouldn't be relevant for antitrust analysis because the regulators wouldn't be looking at competition in that other area. So that was a place I think you could. I find it convincing to see the analysis rerun on that sort of smaller subset where most of their business involves this sort of the websites and into the data that you're using. And then on the issue of HHI, there might be a little bit of an endogeneity. So I would want to know how many repeat offenders do we have here with these data breaches. So we could imagine that a company has a data breach, consumers leave the company because of the data breach, and that lowers their HHI. And they're a company that has, problems with their security, and so then they have a later data breach because they just had bad security to start out with. So that would show that a decrease in HHI causes a data breach, but it's not really the decrease in HHI that's causing it. So I think thinking about that story, maybe dropping repeat offenders would be a way around that as well. You wouldn't have that endogeneity problem. And then I think as you're revising, as you're continuing to add to this and continuing to think about what questions you ask the data, I think one thing that might be helpful to regulators is sort of teasing out the mechanism a little bit more of the way in which the concentration seems to be helping on this. So one alternative explanation, you could imagine that data sharing. So a company is thinking about its data, and they might be concerned about competitors having access to their data. So if this data is available and I'm a competitor, I learn information about how my competitor is, in which demographics are growing, and this gives me a sort of incentive to a way in which I can compete more with them. And so that's something that it's a very different story than the fixed costs and having more resources for privacy. It has to do with how relevant this information is to competitors. So being able to tease out the mechanism would be really helpful to regulators in an antitrust context, because they could say, okay, this is a situation where we should be especially concerned about, or we might think that the benefits of concentration are more likely to materialize and ones where they wouldn't be. But super, super helpful, and lots of room to continue using this data set for great insights.
Thank you very much.
I'd rather hear from people in the audience. So while I recognize almost everyone here, normally I take a few, but you can just raise your hands and we'll start going. And maybe you should say your name because there are a few people in the audience that don't. That's all for that.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for the big writing today. I want to go to the user-based theory of your analysis and suggest to you that maybe the registered offender that you do this on the floor that signals a company cares about compliance in a way that another company doesn't care about compliance, similar to a publicly traded company cares about rules compliance in a way that a private company doesn't care about rules compliance quite the same way, right? There's just certain obligations attached to being registered as that. So that tells me the story that there's a minimum level that you need to reach, which is registration. It doesn't say there's a higher concentration the better, because more compliance if it's highly concentrated. On your chart, you show the Oracle at the top and then Equifax at the bottom. That doesn't suggest to me that Oracle is better compliance than Equifax, just because Oracle has a very high concentrated market share and Equifax has a smaller market share. So that's my first question. And the second question, really, your story is, right, this is competition based on quality, right? And I mean, not that you're perfectly in favor to do this, but the idea that that's the only metric is really important to tease out, because if Google gets rid of cookies altogether, they're going to be the broker for data. And they, there may not be competition on security quality in the same way, but they can jack the price of the time they want on information sharing, because there's no other game in town, right? If there's no cookies, then Google has all of the information, or overwhelming majority of the information, teased out over several years. And so you have this other story of like, part of the story about, quality competition is also a story about like, well, we need enough players in the game so there can be price competition. I know you're able to deal with that part of the story, but I just want to highlight.
So actually, it is worth having conversations just because I want to empower more people to ask questions, so I can give short comments, whereas you're all already empowered to on this side of the podium. So I just want to address, if that's okay, very quickly. So Roger, I agree with you entirely on the first point. This is the equivalent in the finance and accounting literature of why do we have so-called better governed firms that are non-US firms cross-listing on the New York Stock Exchange or on NASDAQ. And it's exactly this kind of quality signal. So the best firm, the so-called best firms for corporate governance, whether it's in, Kenya, India, or Indonesia, right? They're all cross-listing, and these were the ones that seem to have a better corporate governance measurements. And the reason is because they want to signal actually for better for quality. But I'll also do it in a non-finance, non-firm type perspective of everyone just says, we've got the following, crash rating. We were at 5 for US government. There's no grade higher than 5, the way that no one here gets a grade higher than A+. How much above everybody else's awesomeness is irrelevant. It's just we're signaling you're truly at a level of greatness in a classroom setting. And I think that's exactly what's going on. On the second point, so here's the irony. Why is Google phasing it out? Because the regulators told them to. So this goes to the sort of the broader question. I take your point of, be very careful what you wish for. Get competing regulatory approaches which create their own set of distortions. And I think one thing that I want to acknowledge is this is exactly the kind of story that we're talking about. We have a snapshot in time before we have this transition where we can actually look at this and say, what are the set of trade-offs? It's beyond the scope of the paper, but we want regulators across fields thinking about these sets of trade-offs because it's not always clear ex ante what would happen when they choose certain policy objectives over others. And so in that sense, it's part of a broader set of cautionary tales. And hopefully that has empowered students. I want to hear from students. Professor Alford is awesome.
My students have a lot of questions.
Good.
We'll start and then.
Did you see differences in how the data played out in California and Vermont versus like other states because of the policy that they've implemented?
So this is a great question as well. It turns out, no, there were no real differences because they looked at size of the market and who's going to register. It turns out the largest data brokers are going to register and vote that have real national presence. But this is actually something worth expressly putting in the paper.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question about the data broker side of the paper. One of the things that you found was that smaller data brokers generally weren't preferred by marketers. Do you think that affects the kinds of information sold? Do you think that Facebook is willing to sell maybe a more complete data set to a larger, more established data broker? So a small, a data broker that's just 2 guys in a shed with a server. Maybe they're not getting, maybe they can buy information that's much less maybe damaging if it gets to find its way onto the dark web, that kind of thing.
So this is a great question that we don't have good measurements to get to. So in fact, I started to literally call up companies. It turns out as a professor of law, they like sit their lawyer. I'm like, no, we don't want to talk. But when you call, specifically the business unit and say, I'm a professor of business, then they like open their mouths. I'm just like, let me make sure we understand something. You're giving me proprietary information I don't want to have. So there's a role for lawyers. This is the biggest takeaway for all of you of just like really like keep the business unit under control. And this is across areas of compliance.
With the donuts, dude. The donuts.
Right, the donuts. But so when I talk to companies, so it's interesting. Sometimes they prefer the smaller company, like not at that level, but they prefer the more nimble companies because they get better customer service. So for those of you who've dealt with a large bureaucratic organization, You know, they want something that's more personalized. But sometimes they prefer the larger company because the back office part is just so much easier. So the answer is it's mixed. But you have a lot of differentiation across multiple factors, and the best way for me to describe it is to talk about something else that's used. So there are a lot of dating apps. I don't know, I met my wife the old-fashioned way. Someone introduced us. Blind date. I kid you not, on Valentine's Day. If you're not dating on Valentine's Day, you don't know it's Valentine's Day until you wonder, why can't I get a reservation at a restaurant? True story. But it turns out we have a lot of differentiation in dating apps, and it turns out just because it's a large dating app doesn't mean it's necessarily the best dating app for you, because there are all kinds of other factors that you look at. And so actually, turns out that data brokers are a lot like dating apps. There are some that are better for different kinds of connections, and I'll just leave it at that level because that's the level that I want to understand, not what students voluntarily share in class about their dating profiles. Anyway.
Thank you for your paper. My question, I was wondering if you saw any trends across industries in terms of which industries like to use certain data brokers or certain types of data brokers.
So only at the level that we can measure, which goes to, you know, the very non-antitrust specific measures of industry, and this is also a way of saying we have now 2 papers in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that have a similar approach of looking at industry level that's not the same as antitrust level, and yet we are drawing inferences about concentration and competition in those settings. Beyond that, we're not sure, because as Professor Messia correctly notes, when you're competing with your, you know, the part of your industry that's using data brokers, we just don't know. And part of this is simply because companies don't report at that subsidiary level. So I actually want to go to something that Professor Abbasi raised, which is just like, well, Google makes 90% of its money on search. That's goes right and not right. The Google subsidiary Alphabet makes 90% on search because they're one of the few companies that will break it out to that subsidiary level, but only at that broad level. What I really want, what everyone here would really want, I'm sorry, me too, would really, really want is to know, like, every unit, where's the money coming from? Who are you competing with? This is just not how public reporting works, and I wish it did. So I can get anecdote, but I can never really prove the question that you're asking, which is frankly a far more interesting question than the one that I can answer.
Mitch, unprecedented. Everything I know about the dark web, I learned just reading your paper. So just making sure we're not. But how realistic is the assumption that there's homogeneity in dark web monitoring?
So I want to slightly adjust your question. How do we know that we are looking at the right dark web? So the best we know is actually comes from biological sciences. So starting in the 1980s, biologists started to ask a basic question like, how many hippos are there in Africa? Because you could only see some, like on the Nile River, like some like fully out, some just like the little nostrils, and some are just sort of submerged. How many gazelles are in the savannah? We don't know. So there are a number, and I don't think we put it expressly in the paper, but we actually tried to figure out what's the denominator, which is the hard question. And we have very indirect methods for which actually I'm glad we're at a religious institution, because I would say this is much more about faith than anything else. But if we all believe enough and we all share a similar belief, it's right. No, really, I'm a person of faith myself. This is why I love coming here. But at a certain point, we just have to believe it.
Hi. So my question kind of regards to your discussion on first-party cookies and internalizing data. So do you think that companies are internalizing data and using first-party cookies in this way because it's actually less safe to send data off of third parties? Or do you think that it's more driven by a public perception that consumer data is safer or less subject to a data breach if it's less controlled?
So this again gets to sort of what are your prior beliefs, what can we prove, not prove, and so we sort of take it as a matter of faith. So part of it is, do you believe companies when you ask them these very questions? And so there's what people tell me, and then there's what I think the real answer is. The real answer is just based on, my particular set of priors. And I think some companies simply have no choice, right? They don't have enough data that they really have to go to third parties. And again, dating apps is a great example. Because in fact, we had tipping for platforms. Everyone would be on the same dating platform, same dating app. We're not. I'm sorry, by we, I don't literally mean me. I mean, like we as society. Definitely not me. But so the question is, how do you use it? It gets to basically these questions of competitive strategy and sort of what are your resources. So Apple's going to have a very different strategy than Meta, in terms of click to other sites. Some are expressly saying that they compete on privacy. This is what Apple always says. But in some ways it's disingenuous because, of course, they're competing in a way that advantages them. Are other ways just as good? Possibly. The problem is we have plenty of problems with privacy across all of these companies. And one of the largest problems is we don't actually know if we've been breached. And it takes a while to find out. Just last week, we found out that the ABA, the American Bar Association, was breached years ago. I hope you'll change your passwords. Because this went on for years before anyone figured it out. So largely, it's not even a problem of do we know how many hippos are in denial. We don't even know if they were hippos that ate our cookies, or if they were, I don't know, coyotes from the American Southwest. We have no idea who's eating the cookies. I'm mixing metaphors, but I hope you understand. It's just we just don't even know what's been breached. We only know at some point probably every company's been breached. They're the ones that admit to it, and then they're the ones that haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah. I just wanted to put my policy hat on for here and try to understand how, again, your research and paper really tells us, we really try to draw pictures from really theory and stakeholder theory, because I feel like as a policymaker, it makes a difference on which one really is more robust in terms of having an effect on the decision makers. So I was wondering if there's any way for you to be able to measure whether companies are doing this from we just have more resources, if we can better protect our information, or we are doing this because our consumers prefer it, and when there's competition, they'll prefer one over the other. I felt like a lot of the stuff was intuitive. Like if you're a large car manufacturer, of course you're going to look for the biggest market competitor, or the person that has the most other parts or products on the market, so you can trust that. But it doesn't tell us a lot about, again, whether their motivations are behind it. So I think that the information is helpful and it's important, but I don't know if I'm putting in a policymaker seat, whether I'm going to create policy that really incentivizes companies to do this because they have the most resources and they're the better person to do it, or whether it makes sense to do it in a way that incentivizes consumers to go with work with one company over other because they can better protect privacy.
It connects to your, as Lucia's pointed out, deeper question, right, of whether that ancient, unique measure, that more measure, really speaks to concentration as traditionally understood, even if it's not at the product level, but at the firm level in some sense, broader level, but or simply having more resources, which is, you can have very concentrated and have fewer resources.
Yeah, so it's a great question because it assumes, I think, as we heard, actually, do people know what they're giving up on a regular basis? Sort of at what level of privacy do we care? And then, frankly, do consumers care? So this is actually where I want to draw on some of your prior work dealing with behavioral issues. So it turns out there's quite a significant literature on privacy prompts and what we're willing to share and what the consumers say. And it turns out there's this what we call a privacy paradox. There's what we say we care about, then there's what we actually care about. And some of the most oh right,
We don't even know.
fair enough, fair enough. So some of the most interesting work, and all of a sudden I forget, I've reached a point in my career where I forget names, I remember faces. She's a behavioral psych person in marketing at Harvard Business School. She's written a lot about privacy paradox, and starting from her PhD dissertation, so she got to Carnegie Mellon. So at Carnegie Mellon, you have an app that has a Carnegie Mellon brand, and you think it's like pretty good and it looks really sophisticated, and there's all kind of information that you give about yourself, including like age. That, by the way, that's great data to have because that doesn't change. Yeah, you get older, but I mean, like your birth date, like that's very sensitive. And that, unlike say your purchasing pattern from last week, which is going to get stale over time. But what was fascinating is the thing that looks like one of my kids could have created this app, like literally like yesterday. I gave them 3 hours and $500 to do it. That's where students, and again, part of the issue is like, who's your experimental group? But students at Carnegie Mellon, that's super sophisticated, right? They're giving their sexual history, their age, like how often they like drink and drive, and you're just like, what the hell is happening? And it turns out it's the crappier one, the one that you would think is going to be more likely to be reached. That's where people are actually giving away more information. And to me, what it suggests is actually the other literature on sort of like frontal lobal capacity not being fully coming into form until age 25 is probably right, which is why I like my kids living in my house up until the age of 25. But in a sort of the world we actually live in fact, it gets to some of these questions of we don't know. Policy people don't know because these are really complex things. So the best thing that I can suggest is simply we should be having these public discussions, because having these discussions doesn't necessarily get us the best outcome, but at least has us thinking about these things. And so from a policy standpoint, in many ways, having a registry is sort of the least invasive onto companies and their innovation strategies, but at least signals to those consumers who actually really do care. And frankly, by consumers, I mean both companies and consumers like us, in a way that if you care about these issues, at least it's front and center. But in fact, do we really know? Even worse, there's what we say we want, and then there's what we actually do. And as a parent, let me tell you, I see this a lot. But by the way, let me not talk about my personal insecurities as a father. Let's introduce it. So,
Yeah, so thank you. This question stems in part from a comment that Professor Medina made. It's about consumers being seemingly less afraid of the intimidation of the government than private companies. So I would love anyone's objection with why you think that's the case. Do you think this topic about how much private companies are selling consumer data is not discussed enough? Or something that you brought more media attention that just seems a lot more like cut than I guess like some sort of government.
So if I were in a hypothetical setting, I were someone who wanted to go after data, I would go after government data much more because the quality of the defense is much weaker than private companies. So I'll give you the sort of how we think about breaches if you're more criminally oriented. I'm very old for lucky. That but so I want to do a movie analysis. Yes, so reputational penalty really matters here. Anyway, think about it. Again, USC, everything is a movie analogy. So back in the day, the original James Bond movie was told, we're going to try to take over Fort Knox because there's more gold there than anywhere else. That's not how criminals think. because it actually turns out Fort Knox is highly guarded. Criminals are looking for the biggest bang for the buck, right? So every movie that you've seen in the last 15 years involving let's steal money is always like, oh, look how stupid this company is by like leaving all of this like opportunity by like it turns out the person next door has a store and you can sort of drill in or whatever, or like, oh, we're just gonna steal all the money in the world because it turns out that they don't have good internet security. Like that's how most criminals think. It's sort of what is the biggest bang for the buck. So for any of you who've seen either the Spanish version of Money Heist or the Korean version of Money Heist, it's kind of the same thing. And I think we should be actually much more concerned about government data. But to the extent that we are concerned even about data, there's certain data you'd say like, oh, we get like, part of it is the way we describe it in law is really horrifically bad. I want to focus on health data for a second. So we're talking something called regulated health. So you're all familiar with this because even at Notre Dame, someone calls up, some parent says, I want to know, is my child dressed warmly? The best thing you can say is, I'm sorry, FERPA forbids me to even acknowledge whether or not your child is enrolled this semester, let alone whether or not they are dressed warmly in class. By the way, it took me 3 years to actually find out about that rule because I used to teach at University of Florida. I got this call. But so it turns out we're also told that there's unregulated data. That's false. So the FTC actually enforces against that data. And I want to show you the difference, right? If you give it to your doctor, strong penalties, strong, prohibitions. You give that same data to a dating app, it's not the same. And I'll give you the worst case scenario, at least one of them. So there's a company that just went public this year. It's called Grindr. It's a gay dating app. So a few years ago, if you look, there's a New York Times story. What is it that they were selling? Which was totally legal because they got the right customers. HIV stats. Doctor cannot sell that, but I could. And this exactly goes to, so like, who do you think you want to sort of get the data from? You can get it legally, you can reach it, from Grindr. But frankly, I would reach HHS long before I would try to reach, Grindr for data, especially since I can buy it from Grindr. So that's the horror story. I'm like truly, I think one of the most horrific situations that's technically not even a data breach, but part of the sale that, to the question of what does privacy mean, it was totally legal to do that. Any of them?
Hello, I have many questions, but I want to wrap up to you. Maybe the reason why students don't want to give bigger corporations their data is because they're uncomfortable with how bigger companies use that data internally, like what Professor Moxie was talking about, where they're able to keep you in their universe longer, like with the movie Sokol. And if that's the case, maybe the bigger risk of privacy is the internal use by bigger companies and data breaches. And a industry-specific approach, which you already put in paper, would actually more negatively impact the concerns we actually have about privacy.
Possibly. I haven't really thought about it that way. You need to talk to the co-authors about how we might measure that. But it's a very good point.
You could use analytics patent count. I'm kidding.
Oh,
So I think it goes back to this issue of reach, which you just brought up with the Grindr sale. And I'm wondering about exactly what is a privacy breach. I find this a problem whenever I read the privacy literature. Because I think here's a privacy breach, right? If my wife and I are having a discussion inside our home and we haven't involved anybody outside, and somehow there's a piece of code that turns my microphone on my computer sitting there, and it records everything I said to my wife said to me, I'd say that is a privacy breach. But if I go out to buy a pair of running shoes, there are two people involved in that transaction. There's me, and then there's the other couple. And in fact, they own that information. In that their customer list and things like that, they have ownership over that under trade secret law. That's a big asset of theirs, depending on what they have. And so, like, I'm wondering, so I look through, your concept of reach, breach, and it seems like they're different concepts, and maybe I just, spent very little time on this, not enough time because I was writing his name, but, I needed to, I wonder, what, are things really privacy breaches? Like if my running store got hacked and all the shoe sales, which they keep in little things, I know they actually keep milk cards. If that all got found out, I'd be like, a privacy breach. I guess you could call it because I thought they had it in the whole world. But like, I don't know, that's not a privacy breach because I've already done something private. And so too, if I go to the supermarket, like even before the internet, if I go to the supermarket and I'm buying some embarrassing product, right? Like, I meet my neighbor there and it's in my cart. I mean, well,
This goes back to you bought donuts even though you're supposedly on the health care.
That's right. I'm supposedly on a health care. I said, I can't understand how I'm gaining all this weight, but then somebody sees me shopping and they're like, donuts, prime rib, all this other stuff. I'm like, well, he's not serious about it. So I don't know if that's a privacy breach. Like this, I'm already interacting in a social way. And I think it's a very weird thing to say that's privacy when there's no explicit confidentiality. Like I don't go to the grocery store and say, I won't buy anything without explicit confidentiality. I will do that even before federal laws with my doctor. I would say, look, I expect there to be confidentiality. Even if I go to my lawyer and say, I'm going to write a will, I'm going to say, this is a confidential thing. I want there to be attorney-client privilege. I don't want my brother or my cousin to call up and say, but, by the way, what do I get out of this will? You don't know. That's all confidential. But if I go to the supermarket, I don't ask for that kind of confidentiality. So is that a privacy breach if the supermarket's own data, which it has, which is the business record, which they own under state law, they have property rights interests. The Supreme Court said that is property. If that gets taken from them, I can view that as, okay, that's theft of something of value, but is it a privacy breach? Will you count it as a privacy breach?
Right. So the way we count privacy breaches is it material such that you actually have to have an 8K disclosure when we find out that it's on the dark web or somewhere else? The answer is yes, but it's securities law that's telling us that it's a breach. Similarly, there's breach reporting in California that is distinct from securities law. Like, how do we know it's a privacy breach? Because there is some regulatory body, either at the state level or the federal level, that is telling us it's a breach. Is it how you would define a breach? For sure not.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. I think there's the idea of privacy.
Yes.
Way over. I mean, this is why people don't care a lot. In fact, it's stuff that people were never private.
And this gets to some of the issues that you deal with on a regular basis, which is like, well, what does it mean to have information that's private and sort of what counts? And the answer is the same information could either be private or not private depending on who has it and how they got it. And frankly, sometimes in cases it's use. So for example, how does the Federal Trade Commission on consumer protection matters measure damages, right? You actually have to show some economic loss causation. So simply the fact that your social security number has appeared on the dark web, if they have not used it, big problem. And yet it's a real breach, right? So this is a fundamental tension. We have not solved it. Actually gets to the question you said, like, what does it really mean to have some kind of legislation? What is it doing? It's unclear. This is so. In a sense, we have two papers depending on the audience. One for lawyers saying, this is really complicated. Here's an example of how it's complicated. And one, within the broader business literature where there's a lot of increasing convergence across IS, marketing and strategy on these kinds of topics, saying, there's this thing called law. It's more than just a 0 or a 1. But somehow law is both shaping the opportunities and we are responding and to how we think about our business, both in sort of pushing law in a certain direction to get competitive advantage or to respond after the fact to sort of pivot in a way that will make us more
money. I'd like to say also with higher morality, like actually more money. But this is a social purpose conversation. That different audience, different types of research questions, and sort of different areas of focus.
Thanks for the paper. I have a data question. The data question is, I was very disappointed when the cookiedatabase.org was not like a Dash papers. That said, so it seems to me when I went to the site, it seems to me that this is self-reported.
That's right.
So I guess it's just complicated to do selection problem. So what in terms of people reporting concerned about the integrity of the data. The third question is just, I guess I just want to understand, you said that regulators, simply regulators. When I sort of model out what the market looks like, you have data brokers in the middle. At no point are they contacting with or interacting with the people whose privacy breaches. So on the demand side, they're buying data from the market. And on the sell side, they're presumably selling to firms that want to target people. So it's just not clear to me at all how competition is going to, what's the mechanism that competition is supposed to affect another? I think if it is, it's got to be reputational, so maybe it's correct. And so sort of working on those reputational mechanisms, I think would be really helpful for understanding exactly.
So to give a different spin to what you said, we're basically looking at B2B rather than B2C with regards to what data brokers are doing. And we could see this in any kind of, we could look at it no different than someone mentioned car service. You could think about it as, there's some intermediary between the manufacturer and distributor, or some intermediary between the supplier and the manufacturer. And reputation is one of it, but there are other factors that are not easy to observe. Price is going to be one of these issues. Like maybe there's some combination of price and quality that certain people have better, this is where reputation plays a role. Alas, we don't know exactly how these markets work. This is the best we can get. And similarly, with regards to the cookie database, you're absolutely right that how represented is the data, which is why we look at a number of different sources to try to figure out broadly, all of these things, and sort of combined, are we getting a better sense? Essentially, it's like we are like a first-party company that is mixing a series of data that we're getting from third parties and hoping that this gives us a more complete picture. There's actually a reason why we see empirically more papers on B2C markets. And because it's something we can measure much more easily. B2B tends to be far murkier, and typically when we see it, it tends to be at the company level, not at the broader industry level, for exactly the reasons you raised. Like, I would like to know these things, and the problem is no one's willing to part away with their data because that's their secret sauce. In terms of, largely it's even contracts, and no one makes those available.
Interject one thing on this. So you mentioned the idea that the data brokers are central in this, right? And I think that would be interesting to look at actually anymore, because I believe the first-party cookies are central. I think the Facebooks are now the center. If you were to construct a network of the cookie crumb trail, if you will, of the cookies across the sites, I think that the Facebooks and the ecosystem, and they're sort of just ingesting additional data. So going back to your example, I think what's happening is the supermarket is saying, we are the best suited at monetizing this asset. We know that you bought the ribeye steak and the donuts. We want to know if you stopped at the gas station. We want to know what movie you rented. And ultimately, they're going to share a limited amount of information with the gas station and the rental, but they're further monetizing so they can even earlier predict. This is where my example is going to break down, but further predict if you're pregnant, right? So that's I'm mixing analogies here, obviously, but you get the point. And so that's really, I think, what's happening here. At least I think the centrality of the network is changing, and the incentives are only there for the first-party brokers, and their incentive to actually share is less and less if they're good at using that data internally.
So there's one other thing. We have 1 year's worth of data right now. Over time, we would love to be able to collect more and see changes and see these kinds of regulatory changes. And especially now, as business models are changing, and we are actually seeing this happen in real time. Frankly, as Apple makes data sharing much more difficult, involving any other company that's not Apple, for example, and we've seen significant revenue declines across certain industry sectors that have relied a lot on data. So news, video games, frankly, even Facebook itself, or Meta. And so the best I can tell you is we've got a snapshot of what works now. The hope is that by asking these questions, it sort of stimulates a broader conversation across a number of these dimensions. So this is kind of like a first stab paper that hopefully leads to additional questions that with time we can have a better understanding, but I also don't want to overplay it. This is narrow in that it's asking these questions, no one these specific questions, but it's nothing more than an early attempt to sort of map out a particular phenomenon in a way that nobody has to.
Okay, so with that, since we're running out of time, I want to thank Professor Sokol and our panel for.